All right, welcome back to the Flowage Podcast, everybody. This is part 3 on answering the question of why did Jesus have to die? Our last 2 episodes, man, they've been powerful. We saw from the New Testament authors and from Jesus' own words that his death was necessary and that forgiveness of sin was tied to his death. That somehow receiving forgiveness was contingent upon Jesus' death on the cross. And by looking at that, we've uncovered that there are really 2 questions behind this contingency that we need to dive into to be able to answer this question of, why did Jesus have to die? And those 2 questions were, what are we even being forgiven from exactly? Or another way to put that would be, what is it that puts us in the position of needing forgiveness? And 2, in suffering and dying, what did Jesus' death actually do to provide forgiveness? So we've always got these 2 questions in the back of our head, these sub-questions. And so we spent the first episode in this new series about explaining how this very popular Penal Substitutionary Theory of Atonement, or PSA, how that answers those questions. Now, I'm not a supporter of PSA, but here's a recap of that view as it relates to Jesus needing to die. In the PSA model, when we sin, we violate God's holy law. And every sin is worthy of the punishment of death because of how holy God is. Even in the New Testament, it says if you offend the law at just one point, then you're a lawbreaker of it all. So every sin is worthy of death. And not only that, God's anger and his rage, it's aroused by our sins. And the only way to appease God's wrath and his anger, and the only way for an infinitely just God to be able to deal with sin, is for him to carry out the just penalty of the law on the offenders. No, there's no other way to release offenders from their consequences of sin. God's hands are tied. It's impossible. God must have blood. And this is because God's sense of justice overrides any ability to forgive without first the due payment of sin being rendered to the offender. I call this concept getting paid back, or exacting the punishment first as the means to forgive, as retributive forgiveness. Then on the second episode of this series, we spent some time looking at how the way Jesus forgave people and forgave people's sins when he was on earth. And what we saw was that his type of forgiveness reflects not a retributive forgiveness or retributive forgiveness, but a radical forgiveness. A form of forgiveness that functions way different than that retributive forgiveness and the PSA model of atonement. We looked at a ton of different New Testament examples where Jesus fully forgave long before he ever went to the cross and suffered. We saw how Jesus forgave without any sort of repayment on the debts that we think that sin creates. And we saw how Jesus forgave completely, thoroughly, and in such a way that a person was forgiven the full forgiveness that their sins were forgiven, without any inkling or any hint that their forgiveness was merely symbolic or probationary until Jesus completed his work on the cross. Oftentimes Jesus even proved that their forgiveness was a done deal and complete through physically healing them or releasing them from demonic oppression. And we looked at a few Old Testament examples of radical forgiveness as well. And the point that I made from all those examples was that I believe that this radical forgiveness, not substitutionary and retributionary forgiveness, is the more Jesus-centered view. So yes, I'm still saying that Jesus needed to die on the cross to bring about this reality of forgiveness to all humans on earth. But the ability for God to forgive sins, that was not limited to the cross. Jesus' dying on the cross wasn't what enabled God to forgive. God's ability to forgive has always been here for us through faith. Now, did you catch that? Because that's a really important, nuanced statement that it has made. Yes, Jesus needed to die on the cross for us to be able to receive forgiveness. But the ability for God to forgive was not limited by the cross. Jesus was fully forgiving sin long before his work on the cross. And if this is true, it must reshape the way we look at the reason why Jesus had to die. No, I don't believe that the Father needed to take out his anger and wrath upon his Son in a violent, bloody way in order for him to be able to forgive us. Nor do I believe that God had to penally punish his Son in order for him to release us from the debts we created from our sin. No, God can radically forgive without the need to get paid back, or without having to execute punishment or legal consequences on the sinner. He can absolve sin without the need for him to get involved and actively punish somebody. Now, today's episode focuses in on this pushback that I get concerning Jesus' radical type of forgiveness. And much of that pushback comes from two concepts in the Old Testament. Not entirely, but these are the two that I'm going to cover in this mini-series. And the first place is on the Old Testament commandments for offering animal sacrifices. And what was the point, of that those sacrifices served? We'll get to that in a little bit in some later episodes in the series. But the second place where I get pushback on this idea of radical forgiveness is regarding the law, which is the title of this episode here, the law number 1 here, Roman numeral 1. And the law is also called the law of Moses. Sometimes we shorten it to just being the 10 Commandments. But to say just the 10 Commandments is a misnomer, because there's actually 613, or maybe even a few more. There's 613 commandments total when you look at Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. Give or take 613. But you can refer to the 10 Commandments if you want. Now, this topic of the law, that's what we're going to start examining today, because this is, just the place where so much pushback is given to me. Now, I started setting up this topic about the law of Moses at the end of the last episode, when we looked at Jesus radically forgiving in the Gospel of John chapter 8, and the story of the woman caught in the very act of adultery. Clearly, and just how everyone reads this parable, Jesus is seen radically forgiving this woman. I mean, no retribution for her wrongs are issued or carried out in order for Jesus to forgive her of her capital offense. And that's what we love about Jesus and what draws us to him, isn't it? Not that God, requires some type of violent future retribution to forgive her sin. No, Jesus just said, I don't condemn you either. But women, go and sin no more. Now, Jesus forgiving this woman isn't such a big deal to us today living in the 21st century, or most of us live in countries where cheating on your husband's not going to get you in any trouble with the law. But the story, it is significant in the time that the Gospels were written, in the time that Jesus was around, because the Jewish people that Jesus came to in that first century, they're supposed to be following their Jewish Bible, which is our Old Testament. And a big chunk of that Jewish Bible, the Pentateuch, is made of the law of Moses, which it lays out those 613 strict ethical and communal laws. Those 613 laws, they're laid out really in two ways, which it instructs the community how to love God, like to keep the Sabbath, things like that, and how to love your neighbor as yourself. Do not commit adultery, do not lie, do not steal, and so forth like that. But two, it also gives instructions to the community for how they have to respond to those whose behavior breaks those laws. Ooh, ouch. And I don't mean that jokingly. I mean, if you read the law, boy, it's not good. I mean, lawbreakers, what do you do with those, right? And concerning point number 2 here, what we saw from that last episode is that the law of Moses demanded that adulteresses be stoned. that the woman caught in the act of adultery must be murdered in cold blood at the hands of the community for breaking God's law. And what we saw from a flat reading of the text from the Old Testament, that's what the law said to do. Murder. And that's what needed to be done. No questions asked, just do it. Now the point of contention with those who hold the PSA view and those who hold similar views like mine comes down to this question. How was Jesus able to get around a direct commandment in the law? Because that's what Jesus did when he met this woman caught in the act of adultery. How did Jesus avoid carrying out something that's so clearly stated in the law as it is with murder for the crime of adultery? A law that God literally handed down to Moses on Mount Sinai, who then gave it to the Israelites firsthand. I mean, really, how did Jesus get away with this? Especially when you have Jesus himself making statements like this in Matthew chapter 5. Jesus says, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law of the prophets." Or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly, I say to you, until heaven and earth passes away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Boy, I hope your head's spinning, because that's how my head used to spin when I looked at these comparisons between the Old Testament law and what Jesus says. I mean, do you see the contradictions here? Jesus is supposed to be keeping and fulfilling all of the Mosaic law, and perfectly. Yet when confronted with the woman caught in the act of adultery, Jesus doesn't do it the flat, surface level reading of the text demands. So that's the problem here, folks. With a flat, surface reading of the 613 commandments, Jesus either violated God's law and is himself a sinner after all, and we've been duped this whole time. Or there's something else going on. Well, PSA and my own view, we both agree on this point, that there is something more going on to the story here, right? Because we both agree that Jesus fully kept the law and did not offend it at one point. We both agree that Jesus was sinless. But how Jesus excused himself from what appears to be this blatant violation of the law, that's what the two views disagree about. Many from the PSA view argue that the adulterers got off on a technicality. For them, they believe Jesus would have condoned the stoning had there not been certain mitigating circumstances in his culture that prevented him so. And I explained the reasons for these technicalities last time, which, if this is the case, it reduces down to what many see as this incredible, radical love of Jesus. Well, into merely a technicality and not radical forgiveness at all. This is because those who hold the PSA, they believe that the entire Mosaic law, the 613 laws given to Moses on Mount Sinai, perfectly mirrors and represents what God's system is, what God's character is, and what God's nature of justice looks like in heaven. Stop and think about that for just a moment. Because this isn't just what those who hold the penal substitution atonement think. This is what most Christians think when they read the Old Testament. They believe that God's kind of justice looks exactly the same as our human penal system that we have now today, including all the retributionary punishments that go with it that were in the Old Testament. In fact, you can make the argument that our current legal and penal systems are based upon the principles in the Mosaic Law. Therefore, God must respond to sin using violence and bloody murder, just like the law of Moses says we ought to respond to sin. Because when God gives the law, he was merely transmitting down to earth an exact replica of how God's system of judgment functions in heaven. Get that? Folks from the PSA view would argue that the violent and bloody pictures of dealing with sin as found in the law, that they're perfect representations of how God must act. Therefore, God must punish sin with death because the law commands it, and that is the correct and only godly way of dealing with sin. In fact, the bloody and violent ways of dealing with sin in the law, that's the highest form of justice towards those who sin against an infinitely holy God, because it's written perfectly so in God's holy Old Testament law. Boy, good thing the woman caught in the act of adultery got off on a technicality. Otherwise, she would have been toast. Now, back to the original question of this series. The reason then for why did Jesus die on the cross is because Jesus took upon himself all the bloody, violent consequences for sin as our substitute that God had to enact on humanity, as was written in the Old Testament law. Get it? The law then becomes the proof text for justifying all of the torture and the pain and the agony that Jesus suffered at the hand of God on the cross. The law says all must die because all are sinners. Therefore, who can argue against this holy law? That's why Jesus had to become the substitute for all the consequences that we have built up for ourselves over the eons of time. And Jesus becomes the one who God violently afflicts in order to appease and settle God's demand for justice. Now, I know it took me a little while to get to my point here, but hopefully through sharing all that, you can see how the law becomes a part of the logical reasoning to support the penal substitutionary atonement view. Whew. Talk about maybe needing a brain break here. You can hit pause if you need to on all that. But folks, that's just the introduction to this whole topic of the law, the subtopic we're doing in this mini-series on why Jesus had to die. And I'm spending all the time on that because you can see how it intersects with many of the the popular way that a lot of conservative Christians view the reason why Jesus had to die on the cross. That's why we have to spend so much time on this. But here we go, folks. I'm now going to go through an introduction into the law of Moses. And through this next couple episodes in the series, I'm going to share with you why I think the law of Moses, and looking at it that way, is incorrect and that it's not Jesus-centered. And to get there, I'm going to have to start with some really basic stuff here, because we need to rebuild the foundation of the story of God that the Bible sets the Mosaic and 613 Old Testament laws upon. So let's go all the way back to the biblical story and see how the law came into being in the first place, and we'll include some historical and cultural context so we get a more fuller picture. Now, diving into this Mosaic law now, most of us are familiar with the Ten Commandments and, how they tell us to behave towards others, like do not kill, do not murder, don't commit adultery, and so on. So yeah, most folks know a little bit about the law, but as I said, there's actually 613 laws in the Mosaic law. I mean, you don't have to know what they all are, nor would I expect any of the listeners here to be familiar with all of them, because neither do I. But because our knowledge of the law is limited usually to this 10 Commandments, because that's as far as our Sunday school lessons went, we don't realize that there's way more to the law than instructions for how to just be nice to people. It's much more detailed than that, and it's much more ugly than that. There are laws that talk about, how the Jewish community needs to keep the Sabbath and keep Saturday as a holy day to God, and all the different festivals and rituals you're supposed to do. And there's laws about how all the male babies in the community must be circumcised. And there's laws about what type of food to eat to make sure you're keeping your food kosher. And there's even laws about not wearing two different types of clothing at the same time. Like in our modern age, that means you can't wear spandex and wool. And there's laws about not having two different types of seeds in your garden when you have one row of vegetables, You can't have two different plants going in the same row. I mean, there's all kinds of goofy stuff, and some of those seem goofy, others seem just completely outdated and don't even make sense to us. But the good news for us is that Jesus summed up the law by saying the main point behind it was to show us how to love God and to love others. That's how you can sum up the whole law. So thank you, Jesus, for clarifying that. But we got a problem. There's a whole other side of the law that a lot of folks don't know about, and this is the extremely violent, bloody, and gruesome part. The other side of the law is that it lists commandments that the community must dispense out on those who do not abide by the laws and the commands. And I suppose if you grew up in a conservative church, maybe like mine, or maybe you've read the Old Testament for yourself, you might be aware of this and familiar with some of these other commandments, right? But for those of you who are not familiar, you might be surprised to find that the God who claims to be all about love put in his commandments that those who fail to love their neighbor, they're in deep doo-doo. So much so that those who fail to keep the law must receive incredibly harsh penalties and consequences for their actions. For example, if two people commit adultery, the penalty is death for both of them. I mean, that's what the law of Moses commands. We've already saw that. The adulterers need to be dragged out of the city and stoned. Now, in a 21st century mindset, that seems not only incredibly harsh, but insane. It's crazy stuff like that that drove our founding fathers to write the 8th Amendment in our Constitution in America that says there should be no cruel or unusual punishment. That's a slow, painful way to die. But these types of relational, ethical, and criminal offenses had harsh penalties under the law of Moses, which for some of us, okay, most of us, makes it difficult to reconcile the loving picture of God that we see in the person of Jesus, who radically forgave the adulteress, with the God of the Old Testament who demands death penalties for failing to keep his commandments. Now, I've already said that in the New Testament, Jesus says that the entire law can be summed up in two things: to love God with your whole being and to love others as yourself. So even if you don't know the whole law of Moses, that's about the best summary you're ever going to get regarding what the law is about. But you see, if we take Jesus' words literally, right, concerning the whole law, well, that puts us into a little problem concerning the law of Moses. Because if the law of Moses is summarized by loving God and loving others, does that mean to say that it's loving and right to repay people's sins with harsh punishments, including death by stoning? Or another way to phrase that question, when Jesus said that the whole entire law is summed up by loving God and loving others, was he only talking about the moral and ethical laws that show us how to behave right towards God and others? Or was Jesus also including that it's correct and loving to treat sinners with harsh penalties, including death? Do you see the dilemma that I'm talking about here, guys? There's two facets of the law going on, and we have to acknowledge that. Because on one hand, we have all this moral and ethical directions for how to love God and to love others, and those we can agree with. Most of those are fine, right? No problems there. But on the other hand, we have all the consequences for breaking those directions, which appear like these mandatory legal and penal penalties. And they're gruesome and bloody and violent. So that makes us ask ourselves, hey, if demanding legal and penal penalties for sin, if that's in the law, then that must be the way that God deals with sin in the heavenly realm, right? Aha, you see, if it's in God's law, how could any of God's commandments not be a perfect reflection of his justice? How could something be there in God's law that doesn't reflect God's character and nature perfectly? I know we're getting into some deep stuff here, so if you need to think about that, go ahead and think about it. This is the stuff that I was just presented as a kid. These are the natural questions I thought, well, if it's in the Bible, just take it all just the way it is. I mean, that must mean how God is, even if it doesn't make sense to me. And I guess we're really happy that Jesus come around and kind of brought some different stuff, but I guess if it's in the Bible, I just read it, just take it verbatim, take it as a flat reading, and take all the different pages of the Bible, put it in a soup pot, and mix it all around together and see what comes up, and that must be who God is. And even if I don't understand it, just go with it, right? Well, people who hold to this penal substitutionary atonement believe the answer to all those questions is yes. They would argue that God's justice is reflected in those legal and penal penalties perfect. They would argue that the reason why the Mosaic law had legal penalties for sin is because that is the exact way that sin must be accounted for in the heavenly realm as well. That when the law of Moses demands physical punishments for sin, that demand perfectly mirrors what God demands of sinners in heaven. And of course, that's what I believed as well. And that's a really important correlation to note for this episode, because that's the reason why many people push back against me when I argue that Jesus did not need to die on the cross to take upon a physical punishment from God that was demanded upon him due to his infinitely just character. Rather, those from the penal substitutionary atonement camp, they argue that God's need for blood to satisfy his justice is perfectly displayed in the law. And therefore, all one has to do is use that reflection of God's justice in the Old Testament to prove that Jesus needed to take upon our punishments for sin on the cross, so that all of God's stored up wrath and anger towards all of our wrongdoing would be satisfied. The law demands death to a sinner because that is what God demands of all sinners. Therefore, Jesus stood in our place to take the legal demands of the law required, so that way we didn't have to suffer all those eternal consequences and those physical consequences and the eternal consequences of death and hell. And furthermore, God wasn't bound to repay sinners with death merely because he gave the law of Moses to the Israelites. No, God is bound to repay sinners with death because that's how God's nature and justice works in heaven. That's what those from the PSA view hold. See, God's nature of being infinitely just, it means that he cannot just forgive radically or outright or freely. God needs violence and God needs bloodshed in order for fairness to be settled, in order for human beings to be forgiven. The equation of justice, the justice equation, can't be balanced unless there's tit for tat or an eye for an eye. Get it? And all this means that retributionary forgiveness is the only forgiveness that God can give. Just as we see that working out in God's holy law and those 613 commandments. All right, that is where we're going to stop for today. That's going to be our little introduction to the law. And I just want to say how this penal substitutionary view of atonement, how it uses the law as a proof text to support that Jesus needed to receive violence at the hand of the Father. So I've covered all that. What we're going to do next time is pick up right where we left off here, and we're going to go and talk about the cultural context and the historical context that the law was issued and given in, and see if there's a little bit more insight we can pull out about the law from the scriptures that can give us a little more information about the real reason why the law was given and how Jesus fulfills that law. And we'll look at some other passages too. So thanks for checking this episode out. It's a lot of stuff in there, but that gives you a really good idea of how I get pushed back on this idea of Jesus' radical forgiveness. We'll see you next time, and be blessed.